Now, here we have 10,000 young people, 10,000 hopes for Mexico. They are between 18 and 22 years of age. And I believe that at that age, perhaps a bit younger, when you were at the beginning of high school, you had the opportunity to meet and to listen to Martin Luther King.
Yes.
How did that inspire you, and what other experiences did you have at youth which contributed to your strong commitment for social justice and inclusion?
Well, you're absolutely right. I was 14 years old, and I had the opportunity to hear Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak in downtown Chicago, and it was transformational. The title of his speech is "Stay Awake During the Revolution." And the message was that great change is happening around you, and you have a choice. You can be on the sidelines, or you can pull the covers over your head and pretend it's not happening, or you can follow it, study it, and find a way to perhaps participate. And that was at the beginning of my awareness of the civil rights revolution, because until then I had seen stories in the news, but I didn't really grasp what it was about. And what I realized, and what Dr. King made clear, is that it wasn't just about African Americans in the South. It was about everyone in our country, our attitudes toward each other, and that included me. So it was a pivotal moment in my thinking about social justice, and the 1960s in the United States were a very challenging time. Civil rights movement, the assassination of President Kennedy, the beginning of the American involvement in the Vietnam War, the assassinations of Dr. King and Robert Kennedy, the beginning of the women's movement. There was so much happening, and I became much more interested in learning about all of it and trying to understand it better.
In a few words, what do you think are the main attributes needed to be a leader, and does experience shape you?
I certainly believe experience shapes all of us. We can either be a prisoner of our experience, as I was saying earlier, or we can learn from our experience and use it to expand our understanding. And I think if you are a leader, whether you are a leader in your community or in your business or in any institution or even in your country, education is key. You do have to try to learn as much as you can about the world that you are part of. Hopefully acquire skills that will enable you to make a specific contribution. But you also have to be humble. You have to approach any leadership position with humility, because you do not have all the answers, no matter how well educated or well traveled or well read you might be. I think humility is a very important value for a leader. I think the ability to listen, and listen carefully to different points of view, and then to make a decision that is a well thought out decision, and then to follow through on that decision. So I think leadership traits can be found in many, many different people, in many different settings, but those are some of the values that I would always like to see in a leader.
And I'm sure we have a lot of them here in
Yes.
this auditorium. So you had your honeymoon in Acapulco. I was very happy to hear that. And you have remained in contact with our country through time. How do you see Mexico today? And where do you see our partnership moving forward?
Well, I really do believe, as I said in the beginning, that Mexico's future is extraordinarily positive, depending upon the decisions that are made by Mexicans inside your country. I think economically and socially, there are so many advances. It needs to keep going, dealing with inequality, dealing with barriers to opportunity, whether it's inadequate educational opportunities or grinding poverty that has to be addressed. Those are issues you share with us and with the vast majority of countries in the world today. I also believe, and it's what I tried to do as Secretary of State, that our relationship between the United States and Mexico is critical to both of us, to North America, to the hemisphere, and to the world. We have to work together. We have to cooperate where we can. There are many examples of where we are. I want to give you a quick one. When I became Secretary of State, that first year we had the SARS epidemic, you know, that influenza-like disease that was spreading around the world and so easily contagious. And there was an outbreak of it in Mexico. The Mexican authorities handled it extraordinarily well, with help from the United States and Canada. Why? Because we had worked together on what would happen if there was an outbreak in one of our 3 countries in North America. What would be the resources that would be necessary to address it? And it all worked like clockwork. Now, you know when government doesn't work because you can see the failures and the disappointments. But when government does work, and it works well on many things every single day, sometimes people don't know that it worked well. This was an example of the Mexican government, and particularly the health experts, working extremely effectively. So we need more of that. We need more cooperation, we need more planning together, and it's something I certainly advocated for when I was Secretary of State.
Given its core values, how do you see the mission of the U.S. in this century, with so many transformations going on?
Well, I think the United States has to continue at home making sure that we don't lose the American dream. You know, the American dream is a kind of shorthand for people having the opportunity to make the most of themselves, having economic opportunity, having the rule of law, having the chance to, you know, flourish and pursue education and other experiences, and particularly in the creation of a broad-based middle class. You know, there are rich people anywhere in the world, literally anywhere in the world, and there are very many poor people anywhere in the world. But based on the 20th century, and what I see in the 21st century is it's a broad, growing middle class that really makes a country take off, that provides maximum development, broad-based prosperity, inclusive prosperity. And we have work to do in our own country to kind of get that engine going full speed again after the Great Recession and some of our problems because of that. I think the same here in Mexico, growing a broad-based middle class where people have a real stake in their futures, where they feel they can get ahead, where they think their children can have a better opportunity. That's happening here. You can see the statistics, you can hear the stories. So I think in our case in the United States, we, number one, have to get our own American dream engine moving again, and then we have to demonstrate and provide leadership. You know, I'm well aware that everything we do is not perfect, that there is room for criticizing the United States going back over years, but what I have learned as Secretary of State and before that as a United States Senator is that every problem in the world cannot be solved by the United States, but there is not a problem in the world that can be solved without the United States. And so part of what we have to do is demonstrate careful, prudent, smart leadership, using our position in the world to try to help solve problems. And that's what I hope that we will continue to do, and do in different ways now that we're living in such a more challenging time in this century.
The next question I have to put to you, because otherwise the people in this room are not going to let me go out, and as you can see, they are many. Having lived for 8 years at the White House, so you know the drill, and you saw the drill, what would motivate you the most to return to it as President, Head of State, and Head of Government?
Well, I would answer this question hypothetically. You know what a hypothetical question is. I did have the extraordinary privilege of being in the White House when Bill was president for 8 years. And I saw what worked and I saw what didn't work. And then for 8 years after that, I was in the Senate And I worked with the White House under President Bush when I could, and I opposed it when I had to. And then I had the very hard-fought primary campaign with President Obama, and he won and I lost, and he asked me to be Secretary of State. And at first I said no, because I wanted to stay in the Senate. But eventually he was very persuasive, and I said yes. So I worked closely with him. So I do have a unique vantage point and set of experiences about what makes the United States operate well and what doesn't, and what a president can do and should be doing. So I am going to be making a decision around probably after the first of the year about whether I'm going to run again or not. But I think the most important question anybody should ask who's thinking about it is not whether you're going to run or whether you're going to win. It is, what's your vision for the country, and can you lead us there? And I will have to be convinced that I have a very clear vision with an agenda of what I think needs to be done, and that I have the experience and know-how to lead not just those who agree with me, but those who disagree with me, to try to achieve those goals. And that's it's a very serious undertaking. So obviously I'm thinking about it, but I have not made a decision yet.
Well, we wish you much luck in that reflection.
Thank you, thank you.
And I'm sure that many people here would be looking forward to your vision. Mariana Cobos from the Tech asks you whether you have been discriminated at some point in your political career because of being a woman.
Well, the short answer to that is yes, that there is a double standard that is alive and well when it comes to women in public office and in politics. I always give young women the following advice. If you're thinking about or wanting to be in the public arena, the best advice comes from one of my predecessors as First Lady, the extraordinary Eleanor Roosevelt, who said famously that if a woman wants to go into the public arena, she needs to grow skin as thick as the hide of a rhinoceros. Mm-hmm. And what she meant by that is you cannot be detoured or devastated by criticism because it's going to come. You have to learn to take criticism seriously in case there is something to be learned from it, but don't take it personally. That is much easier said than done. I have been criticized on nearly everything you can imagine. And I'm well aware that if I put my toe back into the political process, that will certainly be happening all over again. So it's important that you have good friends and your family and reliable people around you to help you get through that. Because it's not easy, and it certainly is not pleasant ever to be subjected to criticism about important things like your stands on issues, which are fair game. That should be part of the political give and take. But very often it's much more personal than that. You know, I was thinking about the campaigns that I have run. Obviously, when I was supporting my husband or other candidates, it was about them, it wasn't about me. So I would be criticized from time to time, but the focus was on the candidate. And then when I started to run for the Senate in 1999, all of a sudden it was about me. And I think actually it is very difficult for a lot of women to talk about themselves, to ask for support for them. My friend Sheryl Sandberg, who works with Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, has written this really extraordinary book called Lean In, which I think is as applicable to Mexican women as it is to American women. And she just lays it out. There are still assumptions about women, what women can and can't do, about the way women should look, how we should dress, how all of that. And you have to be prepared, and then once you're prepared, it's like preparing for a sporting event. You've studied it, you've learned the plays, you go out there with confidence and you do your best, and you don't get knocked off your stride. You just keep making the case for why you believe you should be either elected or appointed or accepted as a leader. And I hope there are many young women and also young men in this audience who care enough about Mexico's future that you will consider a career in government or politics, because I believe that it still is a very important role for smart, educated people to play.
Thanks so much. Miguel Torres Lopez from Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana asks you, what was the greatest challenge you confronted as Secretary of State?
Well, there were many challenges I confronted as Secretary of State. At the very beginning, the challenge was the collapse of the global economy. When President Obama asked me to serve as his Secretary of State, he said he was going to have to spend the majority of his time trying to figure out how to save our economy from an even worse fate than we already had experienced. And he wanted me to travel around the world dealing with countries that were either upset with us, angry at us, confused by what was going on, and try to restore America's standing and leadership. So that was a big challenge. I made my first trip to Asia because a lot of our debt, as you probably know, is owned by the Chinese and the Japanese. Now, we didn't think they would do something reckless, like sell the American debt, but we couldn't be 100% sure, so we had to be constantly reaching out and meeting and reassuring them. So the very beginning of my time as Secretary of State was particularly challenging. The Arab Spring posed different but equally difficult challenges. It looked for a time as though there really could be an outburst of democracy for people in the Arab world. And the reaction against toppling governments came very quickly, and trying to manage that and trying to be true to our values. A perfect example is Egypt. Egypt had a revolution largely fueled by young people using social media, and Mubarak, the then leader, was forced out of office. I went to Egypt. I went to Tahrir Square. I walked through the square. I talked to Egyptians, and then I went and met with about 30 of the young leaders of the revolution that had toppled Mubarak. And I said to them, so what are you going to do now? Are you going to form a political party? Are you going to form a coalition? Are you going to ask people to run as candidates for parliament and other offices? And you know what they said to me? They said, no, we don't like politics. We're not going to be involved in politics. I said, but if you're not involved in politics, your revolution will be hijacked by one of two very strong forces in your country: the Muslim Brotherhood or the army. They said, no, the people will not permit that to happen. And I said, you know, with all due respect, the United States is the oldest democracy in the world. If you don't have organization, if you don't have candidates, if you don't have a platform that charts a way forward for people to choose, they're going to go back to where they are most comfortable and either vote for a return of a military rule or vote for the Muslim Brotherhood. But I have to say, I was not convincing. I did not persuade the young people to do that, and you know what happened. The Muslim Brotherhood won. In the beginning, we said they won legitimately. We worked with them. We tried to persuade them, starting with President Morsi, to run an inclusive government, to make every Egyptian feel that they had a place at the table. They became much more interested in promoting their ideology. That produced a reaction. The military took over, and now a general has become president. So those were very hard decisions to try to figure out how to manage on all of these fronts. But the point I hope you take away is change for the sake of change is not going to make the difference you hope for unless you are prepared and organized to follow up on that change. And politics, small p politics, is the way people in democracies work together to try to institutionalize the changes that you are seeking. And I don't know if we're going to see any renewal of that kind of hopefulness in the Arab world for quite some time because of the problems that arose as a result of overthrowing existing regimes without anything to fill the vacuum.
You have traveled more than 1 million miles, just the Secretary of State. Mm-hmm. It is a lot.
It is a lot.
Unfortunately, they don't count for frequent flyer miles. Mm-hmm. You have visited more than 110 countries and all the regions in the world.
Right.
So what is your view of the world today? We do have these regional conflicts, but overall, do you think it is a good moment? Is this a moment of transition? Mm-hmm. Are you hopeful?
Well, I am hopeful. I'm hopeful because I do think overall the world is healthier, better educated, more prosperous than it has been in the past. And I am very grateful that those changes have occurred. But I do think that the world that favors rules-based law, that favors the proper balance between liberty and privacy and security and order and constantly trying to make sure that is in balance, countries like yours and mine, most of the countries in our hemisphere, I think the future is very positive for us if we continue to work together and if we listen to each other and we create coalitions and try to solve problems together. I think sub-Saharan Africa is going through a very positive economic transformation. Some of the fastest growing economies in the world are now in sub-Saharan Africa. But there is still a lot of disorder, a lot of conflict, and governments are not strong enough or determined enough to deal with that. In North Africa, we have so much change, and it's not clear yet exactly what's going to happen. And in the Middle East, we see the rise of a very aggressive, hostile form of jihadism through the Islamic State, which is trying to carve out a so-called caliphate in Syria and in Iraq, which is a very direct threat to all of the countries in the region, but even beyond. So, although we have serious issues that we're going to have to deal with, I think on balance, it's very positive. The one exception that I worry about is what's happening in Europe right now. You know, the 20th century was the bloodiest century in the history of humankind. Tens of millions of people killed and murdered in conflict and by their own governments. So at the end of World War II, the goal was to make sure that peace was kept in Europe, and then when the Soviet Union collapsed, the goal was to try to create a positive relationship between Europe and Russia. Mm-hmm. And for more than a decade, that looked possible. When my husband was president, he had a good relationship with Boris Yeltsin. They cooperated on a lot of issues. Russia struck oil and gas, so they were economically growing. But I do worry about President Putin's view that Russia should dominate its borders and intimidate people beyond its borders, using gas and oil as a weapon, even where we're seeing now with Ukraine military force. It's very important that Europe remain whole, stable, and at peace, and that Russia be persuaded or somehow convinced, even coerced, into looking toward the future, not the past. So those are, that's an area that I'm particularly concerned about right now, where people's insecurity, their fear may come to the forefront again. So although we've got problems overall, I think we're at a good stage in history.
Thank you so much. And the last question from Ana Oseguera: where do you find inspiration and drive to carry out your work?
Well, it's so interesting because I find a lot of inspiration and drive from the way I was raised. Whenever I think about the life my mother had and the opportunities she and my father gave me, I'm inspired. And I'm inspired to do my very best, both for her and for me. I'm inspired by the people I meet, the stories they tell me, the terrible problems they've overcome, but their optimism, their resilience, their hopefulness. I'm inspired by my faith and by writers who I read and learn from. During a particularly difficult period in my own life, I read a very provocative, inspiring book by a Jesuit priest named Henri Nouwen. And it was about the parable in the Bible called the prodigal son. And in it was a line about how no matter what your circumstances, there is always something you can be grateful for. Now that sounds kind of hokey and a little bit far-fetched, but I found it very inspiring. No matter what's going on in your life, you can see a flower, you can see a mountain, you can see a happy child, you can see something for which you're grateful, and you can learn the discipline of gratitude. I know about disciplines for study, disciplines for exercise and physical fitness and the like. But that struck me, and it's remained a very important inspiration to me. Practice every single day the discipline of gratitude. No matter how dark and difficult it may appear, find something to be grateful for because it fills you up. It creates energy that is driven by hopefulness that maybe it will get better, and it gives you some food for thought about what you can do to try to resolve difficult situations. So my family, my faith, what I read, people I meet, their stories are both inspirations to me and drivers of action, because I feel like I've been very blessed. I've had an extraordinary life, and part of what I was taught is that I have to keep giving back in some way or another. And that gets me up every morning and gets me about my day to try to find some opportunities to do that.
Well, you have been the first lady that wanted to be a nuclear physicist. At some stage wrote to NASA, perhaps to become an astronaut. Elected to the Senate, ran for president, Secretary of State. But beyond that, I think that what we should also acknowledge is that you are the best known woman in the world, and you are, because of your record, to defend democracy and its principles, your commitment to human rights, your commitment to equality of opportunity between women and men, the service to the brotherhood of peoples, and your resolve to fight on behalf of liberty and social justice. And it is for all those reasons that it has been an honor having you with us this morning. I think we've had an excellent dialogue with Hillary Clinton. It has been fascinating, insightful. We thank you very much for coming all the way to Mexico. We wish you much success in your vision.
Thank you.
And in your future decisions, actions, and plans. And we wish you also good health for you, for your family, and for the new baby that is about to join you in the next few weeks.
That's the most exciting thing in my life. Thank you all very much.
Un fuerte aplauso para Hillary Clinton y mucho éxito en su futuro.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Enjoyed it very much.